Hi, I'm Lynne Sachs. I'm a filmmaker and a member of the Documentary Alliance community. And I'm really pleased to be here today with Kirsten Johnson, who, in my estimation, is one of the visionary thinkers around what I'm going to call today the theater of the real. And I'm really thrilled to be here to talk to Kirsten about her recent work, but to begin with her early films so that we can follow her evolution as a maker and thinker of around the practice of documentary making. So I'm really happy to be here, and we will start. Kirsten and I know each other very well. We're essentially members of a broad family, and it's just such a treat to be able to nab her here and ask her the questions that sometimes we don't have time to talk about, like at dinner. So what a treat to be here with you today, Kirsten.
Hi, Lynn, and thank you to the Documentary Alliance for doing this. It's pretty remarkable for me and giving me a chance to see films I haven't seen in years myself.
Yeah. So I'm going to start off with your 1995 film, Bintu in Paris. And I wanted to start off there because you call it a fiction documentary, or what we today people might call a hybrid documentary. But I think that's very apt because to me, every film made is a documentary of a bunch of people getting together doing something. Like whether you call it a narrative film or you call it an experimental film, if there are people in it, it's a gathering of forces to work essentially collaboratively to produce something that will then go on a screen, which will have light projected on it, and which will then be seen in a dark room, or these days often on a computer. So thinking about that, I wanted you to tell me a little bit about Bintu in Paris, which is you might say, dramatic engagement with the issues of female circumcision. And I'm totally interested in hearing how this film came to be and how you put this group of people together to make it. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I sure can. And, as I said, this opportunity gave me a chance to watch the film again for the first time, literally in decades. And I laughed out loud when I saw that it was sort of billed as a documentary fiction. This is one of my, absolutely, I'm coming out of film school, trying to figure out what kind of cinema I want to make. But my trajectory after I left undergraduate college was to go to Dakar, Senegal. I was really interested in films that West African filmmakers such as Ousmane Sembène, Djibril Diop Bembedi, Souleymane Cissé were making. And I didn't quite yet know I wanted to be a filmmaker, but I went in search of meeting all of these people, which I did. From sort of 1987 to 1989, I was living in Senegal, but I went to FESPACO, which was the film festival in Ouagadougou, and very much immersed myself in this culture of West African fiction filmmaking. And then I went to the film school in Paris, La FEMIS. And I went as the first American student, but I was in the cinematography department. But I was still very much connected to what I had experienced in Senegal. And I had a lot of ties to the West African immigrant communities of filmmakers in Paris. And
Lucky you.
Lucky me. And I did a lot of going out dancing and a lot of going to screenings and seeing people's rough cuts. And so I felt myself to be in a community of filmmakers. And so there was, a lot of debate at that time around how the societies of people who had been a part of or subject to or the victims of French colonialism, how they lived out their lives in Paris. So those were kind of conversations happening all the time. And there were a lot of conversations about feminism and about which cultural traditions needed to be protected, which should be questioned. And, I would say, looking back at it, there was not yet a dialogue that was completely full. It was often a dialogue happening between white French intellectual women on a conceptual level that didn't necessarily include immigrant women. And, I was aware of that at the time, and we were at the French Film School, and we actually had invited Alice Walker to come to the French Film School.
I was hoping you would talk about Alice Walker. Thank you.
Yeah. And she had been, someone who spoke a lot about what we called excision in France, but was, female circumcision is kind of a strange, I don't like to call it circumcision because, not to get graphic here, but it's actually the removal of the clitoris, which is a really different thing than male circumcision. So I tend to like to use the word female genital mutilation is how I would refer to it in English, and in French we refer to it as excision. But what was on the table in France was that it was illegal in France, and that had not been communicated well to a lot of the West African immigrants who were arriving in the country. And then it was communicated very poorly. And then the response amongst some immigrant communities was then to do female genital mutilation on their babies instead of doing them on the preteen girls, because the thought was it would be, it wouldn't be seen in school or whatever, that it could be more hidden. And then, of course, there was the terrible death of a child that resulted from this. So it was very much a conversation happening in French society in the late sort of early 90s. And so I was asked by a group of women who were lawyers to make a film about the subject. And they sort of wanted me to make a documentary. And I think I really wanted to make a fiction film. And so maybe that's why I'm calling it documentary fiction. But obviously this film in some ways is a vehicle for a point of view. And it's very clearly sort of all of the dialogue is we're getting a message across. And in some ways I would say it's almost like a public service announcement.
Well, I think it goes beyond that. I would say that when I saw the film, I was just so struck by its confidence, not only with the cinematography and with the direction, but with your relationship to the performers. That seemed to be that they were as committed as you were to exploring this idea through the film. So we see a group of women who represent a family, and we see a few men who are significant players in their lives, fathers and grandfathers and boyfriends and other men circulating who are trying to figure out what their position is in relationship to this very, very fraught issue. But we also see women, and I think that might be a surprise to viewers from around the world, that this particular topic is not so cut and dry. It's not that it's all bad or all good, because it comes out of a cultural tradition. And so in the film, you give voice to that some of the older women are so committed to this tradition that they are willing to sacrifice, in a sense, their bodies of these young girls to continue their culture. And then the younger women say, no way, we're done with that. And so to me, it is using fiction to talk about something real, and so that's something I think is really remarkable about the film. And I wanted to see if you could talk about those participants. I want to say one other thing, that anybody who's watching this can send us a comment, and I'll integrate that into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, Lynne, one of the things that was so fun for me in being a part of this scene of West African filmmakers in Paris, I'm just going to turn off my notifications, was that I got to meet a lot of West African actors. And so I was friends with quite a few of these people. And there was a lot of sort of frustration about how few speaking roles there were for these particular actors as West Africans in Paris in the early 90s. And there was a whole industry of cinema happening in West Africa, but in Paris, it was kind of like Parisians got to make films at that time. And so there were a lot of people who expressed interest in working with me, who I knew, who were friends. And then we also I remember just doing like sort of this incredibly fun thing of looking for babies, like going to a marketplace in
auditioning babies.
Yeah, and sort of going up to mothers and being like, would you like to have your baby be in a movie? And that was really fun to find that particular family, and also to find the family of the little girl who's in the movie. And we shot it over a handful of days, but the experience of filming it was so interesting because there I was, a white American young woman living in Paris. And I had a friend who was in the 5th arrondissement who had an apartment, who said, happily, you can shoot the film here. So we painted the walls, because I had been influenced by the ideas of Gordon Parks and the idea of, having not white walls for performers of color, but to have, a darker wall so the skin tones would be more luminescent. And I was very committed to this idea of like, everyone's going to be gorgeously shot in this movie, as opposed to documentaries where we, at that period of time, it was often the case that, people weren't lit well in documentaries. And so there we were in this house, and within the first couple of hours of filming, people from the building started coming, asking what we were doing there. And I realized it was because I had brought a group of Black people to the building, and it was a neighborhood in which there were no Black people. And we had sort of in the courtyard, we had set up the place where people could, eat a little bit even between working. And both the crew and the cast was included a fair number of Africans. And by the end of the day, we'd been kicked out of the building.
This is the reason we have conversations like this, because it's so interesting.
Oh my goodness. And it was so devastating. I mean, it was crazy. We had the permission of the person whose apartment it was. We had her permission to use her little, terrace area. And so there was no reason that we should have been kicked out of the building. But apparently neighbor after neighbor had come to the manager of the building to say, why are there so many Black people in our building? And I just remember that being this revelation to me. Like it hadn't occurred to me how disconnected the lives of Black people were from white people in Paris until that moment. And we quickly sort of reconfigured and found another house to film in. But it was this, sort of huge problem for me, who was being it was like one of my first fiction films, and I was trying to make everything, fit and match. And our scene was half shot. And so we had to rewrite. But beyond that was this sort of really sad feeling of having been also excited to work collectively together on this project that we believed was in service of a different way of communicating, and to have it so quickly, it's just shut down in this certain kind of way. But I would say that every single person who was a part of the film had lived in Paris for some time, and they were all collectively against female genital mutilation. Mm-hmm. And they were very clear in their minds that this was a form of activism, this film.
That is so interesting to hear. And, for any filmmaker watching this, that having your location canceled means that you have to adapt. You have to, you had done this kind of meticulous preparation, this notion of painting the walls, like, because you had a set and you wanted all those fabrics and the skin to really like work with the background. So that is
yeah, it was a hard night. It was a hard night trying to find the place where we'd be able to film again. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, what a shift. And you did it all that night.
We found a new place, and, shifted everything and rewrote the scenes. And, in the end, it gave us like 3 more locations, and it was not so much of a loss. But I remember it being just very disturbing on an emotional level for the whole team, that we were not wanted.
Yeah, and it can be so deflating, and then you realize that the project itself has to transcend these obstacles, and in a sense, it's transcending the racism that you all had to confront from day one. So, well, kudos to you for persevering, and for the whole group for doing the same thing. Also, I think that you brought up something around the crew, the team of people who made the film with you. And I think we perhaps think a lot about this now, in 2022, but in 1995, people weren't looking at the gestalt of a film production in such a complex and demographic way. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about those other people who were part of your team, because we see these actors and they're so present and they're so engaged, but we know, because we come out of documentary, that for every time that the actor looks back at the camera, they're seeing multiple people. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I was an incredibly naive 19, 20-year-old when I went to Dakar, and went and literally knocked on Usman Simmons' door and asked whether I could participate in one of his films. And he was sort of like, "How did you get here? What are you doing here?" But then was very generous in even speaking with me, and was a part of me working on a film made by his first assistant director named Clarence Delgado, based on a novel of his called Niwam. And, I was becoming aware of what it meant at that moment in history to be a young white woman sort of landing in Dakar and participating in this filmmaking. And I was the only sort of white person initially who was a part of the team, but then the DP came from France, and part of the team of that film was white, but it was mostly an all Senegalese team. And there was one moment when I was working as a PA on the set, and it was this very intricate scene that involved a bus full of actors, going through the city, going through traffic. And they'd done the take over and over, and it had not worked, and the sun was going down. It was sort of the last take. And they were finishing it, and it was working. And then suddenly someone starts yelling, "Who's the white person in the shot? Who's the white person in the shot?" And I realized that the way the bus had turned in traffic, it had hit a reflection. And there I was, like, directing traffic in the reflection of the windows of the bus. And it was just devastating, because that was it. Shot was blown. Everyone had to wrap for the day and go home. And so this sort of awareness of the different meanings it has to be who you are in different places was very much revealed to me in Senegal. So I was already someone who thought a lot about it. And when I got to Paris, I was just very interested in who got to make films, why, what was the set of people. And there was a fellow student at the FEMIS who was a year younger than me, named Nasser Jepa, who had been an engineer, but was really interested in cinematography. And he was a West African man. I'm not going to totally remember who his parents were, whether he'd grown up in Paris or not, but it was so beautiful to have him behind the camera in this situation. And certainly the actors were also looking to me. I'll never forget the lead actress. I said, "Okay, we've got the take." And she's like, "No, we don't." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Oh, well, I notice whenever you're unhappy with a take, you chew your nail. And I know that you're unhappy with this one." And
That's so observant. Wonderful.
and that was like one of those moments of realizing, like, oh, the looking moves in all directions. I'm being looked at. I'm looking at the people who were making who were filming. So there was so much that I learned on this film. But, when I look at it now, I find it quite mannered. And I see a young director trying to figure out how to cram a bunch of information into a movie. And it's absolutely not a movie that I would make now, I would say, but I kind of love how much we did pack into the short amount of time that it is. And looking at it now, I do feel like some of the things that mattered a lot to me to film people well and to see them, to actually see their physicality through the cinematography. I do think that we did that, which makes me happy.
I would agree. You really do that. I wanted to say a couple of things actually that I didn't know. I didn't know that you knocked on Usman Sembeni's door.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of when I was like around the same age. I wrote an email, not an email, no email.
No, you wrote a letter.
I wrote a letter to Chris Marker, and I said, "Do you need an assistant?" And he said, "Oh, only Americans have assistants." But then we started a correspondence that went on for 30 years, and we ended up working on a film together many years later, like in 2007. So I would say that both of our experiences in that way, like, just be spunky. If you have someone you admire, write them, and they might very well say, "You know what? I could use some help," or "I appreciate your chutzpah. I appreciate that you want to be part of my world, and my films very well." And so, people should do that more.
Yeah, and I mean, I've always been incredibly jealous of the fact that you got to have a relationship with Chris Marker. Like, how incredible is that? But I think about my own young self, and I think there is something that was very different about the oddity of me being a young white American woman visiting Senegal in 1987. Sort of the only other young white people who were there were Peace Corps volunteers. So I was so odd that I was given entrance to many things that, you could imagine a Senegalese immigrant coming to New York and saying, "I want to go knock on the door of, whoever," and not having the door open.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's also sort of noticing who gets doors open to them, who doesn't. But certainly trying and seeing if it might possibly work gets you further than not trying.
I also wanted to say one other thing, that the first international film festival I ever attended, I was not part of, I just went to, was FESPACO in Burkina Faso.
Really?
Ouagadougou. And so who knew? We should have found this out a long time ago. But
what year did you go, Lynne?
91.
Wow.
Yeah, so we were there.
Yeah,
I think
highly recommend to anyone. It's one of the great film festivals of the world.
Yeah, and most of the films are outdoors, so people are concerned about those kind of things these days, and the audiences are very, very responsive. And I saw amazing films. It's hard to get to, but once you're there, you're very glad that you are. Okay, so actually, this leads me to another film which is on Doc Alliance, and that is Deadline. And it has ostensibly a very different feel. For one thing, you don't have control. There's a word, like we talk a lot. You don't have control of a mise en scène. Things have to go with the ways that the legal system offers you. And in this case, we're talking about capital punishment and a kind of surprising and astounding shift going on in the early 2000s around the issue of capital punishment, but also the perception of it. And so I was wondering if you could talk about what got you started on that film.
Yeah, well, once I moved to the United States in the late 90s, I started collaborating with Katie Chevigny, who was the co-founder of Big Mouth Films. And she had supported me as a producer working on my first documentary, which is called Innocent Until Proven Guilty, which showed on HBO, which followed James Foreman Jr., the son of the civil rights activist James Foreman Sr. And we made that film together, me in the role of director, her in the role of producer. But we were both incredibly interested in addressing how racism permeates the criminal justice system. We were, people were becoming more and more aware of the issue of mass incarceration at the time. And working on Innocent Until Proven Guilty really moved me to want to keep working in that vein as a documentarian. And so she and I got the idea of working on a film about the way in which the Supreme Court had struck down the death penalty in the early 1970s. And so we thought we were working on a historical film until we found ourselves in the South, filming with this warden who had been a warden who had put people to death. And he said, "Oh yeah, BBC came and filmed me years ago." And we were like, "Oh, cool. There's footage of him from before." And in the middle of all of that, we get this phone call saying, Governor Ryan in the state of Illinois is really alarmed by this new evidence that there are innocent people on death row, and he wants to hold some hearings, and it's going to be open to the public. You should come up here. So Katie and I, have to give great credit to Katie, her sort of willingness to say, let's take a risk with the filmmaking and try to figure out how this might be relevant to now and to what we're doing. But it was because we were doing it with our own money and for our own reasons that we just decided, okay, even though we're down in the South making a film about the 1970s and it's historical, let's go to Chicago. And let's go to Chicago and film these hearings. And that turned out to be just an exceptional experience. We filmed 167 death penalty hearings, so it's basically 1 hour was given to each case. And it was over the course of, several days, but it was incredibly intense. And it was remarkable what was happening in that courtroom. And we made friends with a couple of the judges who were doing the hearing in the case. And they let us move just a little bit, but just enough so that I had angles that meant we could cut these fixed, locked off camera shots as scenes where someone was pleading and someone was listening and we could see the crowd. And we immediately became just very caught up in how powerful this live footage was, as opposed to the archival footage that we had found for the film we were making. And so suddenly we said, hey, we're going to put these two movies together. But we never thought that Governor Ryan, who was a Republican governor, would ever change his mind about the death penalty. And in fact, he did. And that happened while we were filming. So we had this sort of very surprising ending to a project that had started as something completely different, which is a common thing in documentary, we know.
I thought that was absolutely so compelling, because some people who make documentaries believe that you need to follow a character, and neither of us really believe that. We don't kind of buy into that. But every once in a while, a story or witnessing of a mind, that's what it was. You were given the opportunity to see a mind transforming, and that's so unusually. Film is so much about movement and action, and usually when we see when we have a sense of the mind going into a position of doubt, it's often narration or the part of the filmmaker. But what you all caught in that film was a person with an enormous amount of power, and who would be judged for a decision that he made for forever, for the rest of his life. It might have been the biggest decision he ever made if there had been repercussions. And so to see that, and to see it not over dramatized, but to see it positioned with nuance and respect and your own doubt, like you didn't know which way it would go. So could you talk about the governor? It's such an important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what was so interesting is that, many people of that much political power in a state have come up through the criminal justice system. They've been prosecutors, and they are aware of the injustices in the system, and they're not too worried about it. Governor Ryan was completely different. He came from a small town. He had been a pharmacist, and he got into politics without having moved up through this ladder of the criminal justice system. And so he was just shocked over and over about things that someone who might have earlier in their career been a prosecutor would not have been shocked, because they're actually quite endemic throughout the system. But there had been incredible work by a group of journalists at the Chicago Tribune that had sort of unearthed a lot of innocent stories on death row, and that had really hit Governor Ryan as something that was important to pay attention to. And I would say that, Katie and I were coming from a position of being interested in who were the people on death row, and we had met through the course of our work on the historical documentary a couple of just extraordinary individuals, one of whom was this man, David Keaton, who, just was sent to death row and accused of a crime that he hadn't committed in the early 70s, and then was released because the death penalty got abolished by the Supreme Court. And we gotten really close with him as a human. And I remember us thinking, like, how can we ever have Governor Ryan be in the film with as much presence as David is in the film? And because we had all this access to filming with David. He was had an incredibly beautiful way of speaking. And so that was sort of our wish. But then Governor Ryan kept not being available for interviews. We couldn't film with him. And so then this experience of having this warden who I spoke about, who had been a part of executing people and who had deep regrets about it, and really said, the burden that this country places upon state officials who have to carry out the work of executing people is too much. And so he ended up becoming the voice of Governor Ryan in a certain way, because we didn't get an interview with Governor Ryan until the film was almost completely finished. And the interview wasn't that great in the end. So we ended up sort of building, I'm so glad that you experience it that way, Lynn, but we completely built in this sort of structural attempt to map what Governor Ryan went through, but we didn't have access to the inside of his mind. We had some of his actions, and then we had these sort of proxy people who we had access to investigate what is it like to be in a position of power? What is it like to be in a powerless position in this situation? And so those were the solutions that we found. So like most documentaries, we were sort of making do in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to actually take a step back and say that, first of all, both of these films are available on Documentary Alliance. So they give people who know your work a sense of where you're coming from, but they also give people who don't know your work a place to start. So in both ways, I mean, I was just thrilled that I could see your work amongst all of these other international filmmakers, each with their own sense of style, their own commitments to certain issues, and their own filmography, as sometimes it's called. I wanted to talk about one film that is available on the internet to anybody, even if you're not subscribed to a streaming service, and that's the film The Above, because I think that it's a short film, and I think you've always been someone to celebrate the making of a work that doesn't cover what we traditionally call a feature-length evening or slot, or, that has another kind of existence in the world of cinema. I find this film kind of a nice bridge between the two others, because it's so elegant, and it's so attentive to space, to composition, but yet it's dealing with an equally harrowing and disturbing issue. So I can see this dilemma in your work, like that comes for all of us. We want to make something beautiful, but we don't want to talk about beauty. We're talking about something else. And so there's this kind of conundrum around our paintbrush or our pen, and in this case, our camera. So I was wondering if you could introduce the above and just talk about some of those issues.
Oh, Lynn, that's so wonderful of you. And I do think that, that is a theme in my work of trying to look at difficult situations in a loving way, or in a way that is interested in beauty. And it was funny when we were talking, I was thinking, like, what does Deadline and Bintu in Paris have in common? And I was like struck when I rewatched Bintu in Paris. Both films have lots of people in them. We see lots of faces of lots of people. It's not just three characters. There are lots of people seen one by one. And then when you introduced The Above, I was like, oh, there's a film I've made with barely any people in it. but The Above was an opportunity that emerged out of a couple of different films I had worked on as a cinematographer. So I was in Afghanistan working as a cinematographer on Women, War, and Peace, a film that was on PBS that was directed by Ginny Redeker and Abby Disney. And I was also there on behalf of the School Foundation, making sort of a film that highlighted a social entrepreneur, a woman named Sakina Yakubi, who still is in Afghanistan fighting for women's educations. She was there under the Taliban. She's been there through the whole entire American occupation, and she's still there. And in the course of working on those films, I saw that US military surveillance blimp up in the sky. And we happened to be at the American Embassy for filming Women, War, and Peace. And I asked someone, what is that doing there? And the answer was, it's classified and you're not allowed to film it. And of course, as soon as I was told that, I was like, you're telling me I can't film the sky? And that sort of quest to understand what having that surveillance blimp in the sky meant to people led me all over the city. And I simply, sort of went anywhere I could where I could see the blimp, which turned out to be everywhere, at the top of mountains, down in the market, on top of a Ferris wheel. And so it became almost this sort of game for me. Where can I see the blimp from, and how can I see it? But it wasn't until 5 years after I filmed that footage that I read something in the paper about a blimp going up in Maryland. And suddenly I said, oh, there's a movie. And that happened to correspond with the beginning of Field of Vision, which was a project just sort of happening in the imagination of Laura Poitras and Charlotte Cook and AJ Shank. And so that was just starting. It was in the first group of films funded by Field of Vision, which has gone on now to make hundreds of short films and is an incredible resource for all of us, both as a body of films and as an ongoing production project. But so they gave me some money to do the editing of footage that I had been holding on to for 5 years, basically.
Oh, that actually...
And Lynn, when my dad sees it, he says it's my most autobiographical film.
Well, every film is like an emblem of a period of time for me. Like if you say, well, what were you doing in 2001? I'll say I was following war protesters around making Investigation of a Flame, and also taking care of my children. So it's all tied in, and because film is so immersive.
It goes back to what you were saying earlier, that each film is a documentary of the people who made it, as well as where in the life of the filmmaker it happened. But The Above for me in many ways speaks to my childhood religious belief that God knew my thoughts before I thought them. And so the blimp sort of functions as this all-seeing, all-knowing presence in the world. And it was just so incredible for me to encounter this Afghan man in the market who basically said the same words I would have said as a child about who God was and what God did.
Right. Also, you said something about the fact that you had to film this, but you didn't know where it was going. So that leads me to a question around this personal archive that lots of us have, that we sometimes don't know the direction of our work, and yet we know that we need to film. When are some situations where that's happened for you, where you thought, I don't know why, of course, if we hear about a protest, we're going to be there, but that's kind of like and it's sometimes fantastic, like useful or meaningful. But what about another point in your life where you just said, I'm going to film this and I have no idea why, but it's going to mean something to me later?
Yeah. I mean, I like, obviously in the case of The Above, it was just so incredibly striking, so much contrast. This, giant white blimp in the sky of this very dusty, tan city. And so in that case, it was a complete, I was being called visually. And that determined the compositions, and I was just getting a great deal of visual pleasure out of it, and sort of metaphoric pleasure, a new way of talking about the U.S. military presence in that country. But I think,
can I say I loved your framing in that film, like where you had things move up from the bottom of the frame, like a flag, or you had like a balloon do something.
I walked into a bunch of balloons. Yeah, exactly. I was having
There's a lot of freedom in it, I think.
Well, and I think there was freedom in it because I didn't think I was filming that footage for anybody but myself. I didn't imagine it was going to go into any film. And obviously, given the films that I've made since Cameraperson and Dick Johnson is Dead, part of what has motivated me to film is the sense that someone is disappearing, right? And so between the emergence of my mother's dementia in basically 2001, I would say, I had, because of that relationship with her and with Alzheimer's, I became acutely aware that a person can be there, but their personality can start changing or disappearing. And that was the first time I would say that I really started to think of how filmmaking can sort of help us hold on to moments that are fleeting with people. And so certainly the conundrum of, I wanted to hang on to my mother, but she didn't want me to film her, then morphs into Dick Johnson is Dead, where my father is open to letting me film him as dementia starts to attack his mind. But I would say certainly, I don't film our children all the time, but I do have now, informed by my parents' dementia, I have this sense of, oh, let me film this moment. And not to be a parent who is filming all the time, but in this particular moment, I'm going to film, which, obviously you've done with our children also. I think it's a kind of an incredible thing how children of this generation will have so much more documentation of their childhood than any of the rest of us ever have. And I think my hope is that will be wonderful for them to have that.
Yeah. Actually, this leads me to a question I wanted to ask you, or a quotation from Cameraperson. In the material on James Byrd, I think you say it, but I'm not sure, maybe somebody in front of your camera says it, so I'm going to quote it. Quote, hearing someone talk about it and looking at it is different. So there is this idea that, sorry, there's a lot of airplanes outside right now, but and I was thinking even about today that this call it integral confusion that one can have around filming something that is absolutely horrific. For example, how there was an image of Emmett Till in his casket, which was photographed, I think it was by a photographer for Ebony, but then if you go to the National Museum of African American culture. You see that casket, but you don't see the image of the body in it, and that. So I felt like those were kind of fraught issues throughout Cameraperson. You know, how do I allow us to remember something, as you were just talking about, that if we don't film it, then how do we share it with others or another archive? Is speaking of it equal or parallel to or lesser than? So then these events that, to tell you the truth, most of us would rather forget, but we don't, because the whole impulse of documentary is to not allow us to.
Yeah, well, deeply complicated. You know, when we were filming Deadline, we filmed a group of people whose children had been killed by people who were then sent to death row, and there was a group of those people against capital punishment, and among them was Mamie Till Mobley. And so I got to meet Emmett Till's mother and speak with her about filming and her living a public life and her choice to show the photo of her son. And it was absolutely one of the most profound experiences of my life.
When I saw that, I thought, this is so amazing that you have her in that movie. I was so moved.
Right? You know, how incredible that there she is. And she spent her entire life, you know, being an activist around these deeply complicated issues. You know, on the one hand, very simple, being an activist against white supremacy. On the other hand, this very complex notion of how do we create accountability, are reparations for violence possible, and what does it mean to forgive in the context of all these things? So, you know, it has absolutely been the case for me throughout the course of my filming career that I have had, you know, this sort of remarkable access to speaking to people who have lived through terrible things. So, you know, I filmed over 200 interviews with Holocaust survivors. I've filmed in the aftermath of 5 different genocides. And in all of those cases, you have individuals who it was very difficult to ever speak again of what happened, you know, talking about the difference between speaking and looking. So some people have lived through things that they are so terrible, they wish to never speak of them again. And so I did become very respectful of the act of speaking and how powerful that is. And then, you know, I experienced in a very limited way the scene of some terrible things or the scene of the evidence of some terrible things. So certainly in the case of James Byrd Jr., I saw the evidence book. And I can tell you that is something that no one should see. And it is something that no one should live through, which he didn't, but he lived a long time while he was being violently harmed. And so, you know, it is my sort of deep interest in how do we deal with this conundrum, you know, because the war in the Ukraine is happening, right? The war in Ethiopia is happening. The war in Yemen is happening. We have seen many, many, many images. Is it a part of some of us thinking differently and doing things differently? Often not. And then occasionally something hits someone and shifts something, and we see things differently, and we have a capacity to act in a certain kind of way. So, I mean, the one thing I would say is none of this are one-to-one relationships, right? And I do think that it is meaningful that we have evidence both written, spoken, and visual evidence of some of the most terrible things that humans have ever done to each other. Do I think it is potentially incredibly problematic that others see those images? Yes. And I think in the context of our world now, in the context of an unfiltered internet where we can sort of happen upon a devastatingly violent image without context and sort of mixed with all of the other day-to-day material that we're seeing, I think that has incredible potential to traumatize, do harm, have a complicated outcome. But I do believe that if we only turn away, we've got a problem on our hands. And I think that there are lots of things happening now in society, that lots of work is being done to keep us from seeing the damage that is being done. So this is the stuff of Cameraperson. These are the questions of Cameraperson, and I'm really interested in speaking to these issues. I find it to be so complex and compelling that I don't think about it in terms of answers, but I think of it as an ongoing inquiry and a place of sort of deep importance for us as humans at this moment in history. I have this poster behind me that is a talk that I gave recently, which is called "We Are All Camera People Now." And, we've all got these, we've all got cell phones, and we can all record images and upload them to the internet. And it means that we're seeing things that humans have never seen before in human history. And I think there's a lot more talking that we need to do about it.
So I have a couple of comments. This is from Sue Simon.
Nice.
I like the way you're identifying how the intention of the filmmaker, the feeling they get from the act of filming, really impacts the footage, which I hadn't really, I think that's put so concise, and so intuitive in terms of understanding the somatic relationship you have, for example, to your camera, and how that is articulates a very specific sensibility.
Well, Sue is always one to put things in a pithy and insightful way. She loves poetry, right, Sue? And I would say that was absolutely what I discovered in the making of Cameraperson, that my body was present, and my sort of hopes and wishes and what I was taking in, as well as projecting on what I was seeing, was at play. I think intentions are quite fascinating. It's quite a sort of fascinating philosophical concept of whether it is possible to see the evidence of intention. There's often this sort of difference between intention and action. But I would say in the case of filmmaking, they are both manifest. One's intentions and actions are in the mix, as they clearly are when I see, Deadline or Bintu in Paris. You can see what I want to communicate, whether I succeed in doing it or not, or I'm too heavy-handed, or it's not complex enough yet. All of those questions, I think are up for grabs for me looking at those films. But I'm very happy to have engaged in the intentions that I had at that time to discuss that work.
One more question, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah.
This is from B. Peterson, who says, you mentioned a relationship between your childhood faith and cinema. How does the spiritual, something that is by definition unable to be documented, interact for you with the medium of documentary?
Oh, such an interesting question. Yes, I do believe deeply that there's so much going on under the surface of any situation and inside any person. And I'm very curious, as a camera person, as a filmmaker, what are the clues to being able to see what's going on that is invisible? I don't think I would attach that to an idea of spiritualism. I would just connect it to my own experience of being human and all the stuff that's going on inside of my brain that can't be seen by others. And so that's been one of the joys of my work as a camera person is to sort of search for evidence of things that are not visible.
Oh, well, I'll just say that one of the joys of making the kind of films that we make is that we get to meet other filmmakers, not so much at fancy film festivals, but sort of like on location. You're shooting, I'm shooting, we're all doing the same thing. And you actually mentioned that you made a film, you know, on your own dime, your own dollar, your own euro, whatever it is. Most of us get started that way and actually continue to work that way when we have to. And if we work with our cell phones, we're working on nothing, and we can still make really good work, or we can try. And I'm actually going to say something right here about Documentary Alliance. When I found out how affordable it is and how available it is around the world to anyone who wants to sign up for like 1 month or a year, and the fact that you can see this whole range of work that just a few years ago, and I think you would testify this, you could only see at film festivals.
That's right. My family was always like, we never have seen any of your films until this shift happened. Absolutely.
Yeah, the shift, you know, yes, we miss the theaters, but not everybody lives in big cities where these kind of theaters are, and that you can be anywhere in the world and see this range of cinema that with perspective, with confusion, with a kind of originality and independence. It's pretty fantastic. It all comes out of Documentary Alliance, and I think we're both would agree. We're really,
and I don't think we've given the plug for the fact that your films can also be seen on Documentary Alliance, right, Lynne?
Yeah. They're in a program called Tender Nonfictions that the curator, Christopher Small, created. But I have 11 films on the service. So people can watch both of ours and go back and forth.
Oh, well, thank you so incredibly much for having this conversation with me, Lynne. It's really been interesting for me to revisit sort of the threads of who I have become as a filmmaker in thinking with you about this earlier work. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Documentary Alliance, and bye, everybody.